idea behind this book is that we're in a moment of what we see as great tension between technology and democracy on both sides. So like on the one hand, there's a lot of concern, growing concern, that advances in technology are undermining democracy and pluralism. Issues around fake news, around top-down surveillance, around the way in which technology might be fueling polarization, or at least the formation of sort of communities of common action that are not well mediated by our existing democratic institutions that can lead to conflict. And at the same time, technology kind of feels somewhat under siege from democratic institutions, from the tech lash, from the gradually decreasing role of public institutions in supporting technology development. I have two favorite examples of this. One is that you hear a lot of complaints about Twitter, but does anyone know where the person who developed the protocol that underlies Mastodon, the most serious Twitter competitor, lives? Her name is Christine Lemmer-Weber, and we're all having this nice time at MIT. She lives in a studio apartment in the poorest city in Massachusetts, and she has trouble affording that. The Mastodon, the person who runs Mastodon, which has about 5 million users, has raised a total of $40,000 to support that endeavor. So that's one nice example. Another nice example is that Altman and Musk and so forth shopped around the idea of OpenAI to every nonprofit and public institution there was. So there's all these complaints about OpenAI being, this private, Microsoft. None of them were willing to fund that work. They wanted it to be a publicly controlled thing, not a commercial product, but there wasn't support. So the public sector, which created, in many ways, the internet, has retreated from engagement in democratic countries with supporting advanced technologies to a large extent. And that contrasts, of course, with authoritarian regimes where we've seen something quite different happening, the way that China is building whole cities to support experiments with autonomous vehicles and so forth. What I want to argue, what we want to argue is that this is a result of choices that have been made about the direction of technology that has created inherently a tension between technology and democracy. So the two big trajectories of technology today, and I would argue like they're echoes of investments that really have been made for the last 40 years, are like the cluster of things that you might call AI. So like things that aim to replicate human capabilities, and the cluster of things around crypto, things that aim to like remove the role of various kinds of collective governance and replace them with sort of code-based automated solutions. And there's a bunch of data on here like illustrating this, but it really dates back, I think, to like the late 70s and early 80s when basically there was a decisive shift away from supporting the further development of networking protocols and personal computing by the Defense Department and eventually the NSF towards sort of artificial intelligence-based approaches to weapons systems and cryptography. This very much follows Jerome and Simon's work that some of you are probably familiar with, but like there are different visions of the future of technology. There's different directions we could invest in. And I would encourage people to think of like these directions less as technologies specifically and more like political ideologies. AI is not actually a tool. Like in fact, the architecture of AI has completely changed like multiple times over the last decades. AI is a set of aspirations. It's an aspiration to imitate human behavior in a computational substrate. again, the like whole crypto thing is not really a technology. In fact, the set of goals of it were articulated in the early 1990s by Neil Stephenson, and then again by Lord William Rees-Mogg, and like there's been particular technologies that have instantiated, but the goal set is sort of an anarcho-capitalist, libertarian ideology. And so I would instead encourage us to like think about these as sort of directions that we might pursue, the same way that like, fascism, communism, and democracy are. And so let me try to articulate three clusters that I think are important here. One is, so I actually drew this typology. Sorry, do we have a question? I drew this typology from Civilization VI, the most popular strategy game of all time, which in its latest iteration has 3 future governments that correspond to these different clusters. But I think there's actually names that are probably more appropriate than the ones that they chose. So one you could call corporate libertarianism, or entrepreneurial sovereignty is another name for it. And it's this cluster of stuff around crypto. It emphasizes the way in which technology will make sort of collective governance impossible and irrelevant, and allow sort of market-driven interactions to lead everything. But you can also think of John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. It's another thing in this spirit. Neil Stephenson's work actually tries as a dystopia to portray this world, but nonetheless portrays it. A second direction, which is probably even more familiar, is what they call in this synthetic technocracy. Another term might be abundance technocracy. This is the vision that sort of we can develop AI in such a way that it just provides abundance to everyone. And then once we do that, like the only relevant questions is ensuring that like it doesn't kill us all, and that it gives everyone the right to enjoy that abundance. So that's a second direction. And then the third, which is what I want to like sort of articulate today, is what they call digital democracy in Civ 6, but I'm going to call it plurality, to emphasize the way in which it's sort of a mixture of technology and political philosophy. So let me describe to you sort of the inspiration for going down this route. So there's this lady, Audrey Tang. She's the digital minister of Taiwan. She's the first transgender minister in the world. She came into that position because she helped lead an Occupy movement that occupied the national legislature of Taiwan. So like think January 6th, but less violent. But they actually occupied it for 2 weeks. And she had been leading this civic hacker movement named GovZero, G0V. And what they did is they took government websites under their freedom of information. They had to make the source code available. And so they would fork those websites and put up better versions of the government websites, and then try to shame the government into adopting them. And they, during this occupation, tried to apply those methods to coming up with a consensus involving the public in deliberation of how to resolve this particular crisis that triggered this, that I won't go into. It had to do with the Chinese tech adoption in Taiwan. And that was so successful that the opposition, the government that was the conservative government at the time, adopted all of their proposals and appointed as reverse mentors to every member of the cabinet a member of this movement. And then it proved so popular that actually that government left power, and the one that was more allied to them came into power, and she was appointed first minister with that portfolio, and then that went successfully enough, and now she's in charge of all digital affairs, cybersecurity, et cetera, in Taiwan. And she's done a lot of amazing things. I really encourage you to read about her. She's the most remarkable person I've ever encountered. But one thing that she's very well known for is taking the sort of deliberative technologies which use, and I'll come back to this more later, sort of various kinds of AI-like techniques to enable people to sort of see the disagreements that they're having collectively and to work towards consensus. She built that into a platform that has about a quarter of the national population as monthly active users. So the way I think about it is she took like maybe 10% of the like vitriol that exists on Twitter, and she sort of channeled it into people cooperating to solve important national challenges. And that has ended up having a lot of beneficial effects. Taiwan has sort of, on most of the major crises of our time, been the most effective country in managing them. Like COVID is a great example of this. Statistics there are quite remarkable. Now, Audrey describes the philosophy that underlies this, and this book that we're writing is to further articulate that, as plurality. She has a poetic job description. I'm not sure I'll completely remember it, but it's something like, whenever we hear of user experience, let's think of human experience. Whenever we hear virtual reality, let's talk of a shared reality. Whenever we hear the Internet of Things, let's imagine an Internet of Beings. Whenever we hear, maybe it's artificial intelligence, let's think of collaborative intelligence. And whenever we hear that the singularity is near, let's remember that the plurality is here. So what is this plurality thing? Well, I would argue it is really just the application to sort of the informational organization of human society of the same ideas that transformed physical sciences in the 20th century. So, you know, before the 20th century, we had this sort of Newtonian vision of the world, billiard balls hitting each other. But then we learned that, in fact, there was no absolute position, and that there were no real particles either. That, in fact, those particles were sort of one manifestation of an underlying entangled wave structure that creates the fabric of reality. And of course, that quantum revolution has led to many of the most canonical technologies of the 20th century, from nuclear energy to a lot of computation. Similarly, we moved from sort of a Darwinian, Spencerian understanding of survival of the fittest of individual species to an understanding of ecologies with a whole range of different complex interactions, some positive, some competitive. And that, of course, gave birth to the modern environmental movement, which changed the ways in which we relate to the physical world and nature. And we moved from sort of a phrenological understanding of the human brain, where there were little modules that did various different things, to a networked understanding of the brain, where many of these systems sort of interact and there's a variety of emergent properties. And of course, that has recently led to the tremendous breakthroughs in generative foundation models. And I want to argue that there's a similar perspective that we could take to sort of harnessing information technology to reimagine social organization, and that it emerges from some of the thinkers who were around right at this moment, when all these other sciences were changing. So I particularly want to talk about two that influenced me greatly. One is Georg Simmel, who was one of the founders of sociology, along with Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, but who sort of got dropped out of the textbooks in the 1950s for a funny reason that actually relates to how the internet or the web got its name. But we can talk about that in Q&A if it interests you. But he was the first person to model social interactions using networks. And he had this theory of intersectional identity. So his idea was that there is no primitive notion of a human individual, that humans in early societies were part of tribes, and their identity was entirely defined by their tribe. And that what happens with modernity is that the set of social relations that we're involved in becomes more complex. So we're no longer mating and worshiping and working with the same people. Each of these different spheres of our lives separates out. And as that happens, we become an individual because no one else shares the same pattern of social affiliations we have. So really that reconceives actually that what makes for individuality is actually the fact that the individual is not united. In fact, the united, something that's truly individual, can only exist in a tribe. But in a modern society, there's actually this fragmented self, which allows for the conception of the individual, because there's no longer a group that fully captures your identity. So this, I think, can be seen as like the foundation of imagining the sense in which individuals are not these atoms from which a social system is created, but instead are sort of entangled with the social structures that they in turn create. So that kind of like challenges the individualist conception that underlies, you might think of the Newtonian vision of social relations, that is the sort of individual democracy, blah, blah, blah. John Dewey, one of the greatest theorists of democracy, maybe the greatest American philosopher, challenged in a similar way what democracy should mean in this beautiful book called The Public and Its Problems. So what this book highlights is the fact that as technology evolves, the set of sort of interdependencies, interconnections, relationships among people becomes different and more complex. So people who were not previously connected by a railroad, whose lives might have been relatively independent and maybe well governed by their local town institutions, now get connected by railroads, and now their lives become entangled and interdependent with a new set of people who live along that railroad. Or as we come to understand the climate system, we realize the interdependencies, the environmental interdependencies, and the radio and so forth. So all these new technologies create new forms of interdependence. And in order for people to continue to be democratically governed, it's critical that new polities, new publics emerge to govern those interdependencies. Because otherwise, there's no reason why those will tend to line up with the boundaries of a nation state or a municipality or whatever. They're emergent, they're complex, and they're evolving. And so he argues that in order to like have democracy in the modern world, it can't be nation state democracy. It can't be the democracy of the past. It has to be a democracy that adapts to the changing conditions of technologies. So that sort of challenges the democratic end of the standard, liberal narrative. My view, the view that we argue for, is that the internet actually kind of emerges from this set of ideas, this set of ideas about reimagining society, as kind of like a first proof of concept of what it would mean to take systems like switchboards that had originally been governed in this sort of, there's a bunch of atomized individuals, and then there is the controller, the central clearing hub, and to think of it instead in terms of these interconnecting networks that are partially self-governing but have to reconcile on standards that allows them to interoperate with each other. And in fact, the original inceptor of the internet, one might argue, is this man, J.C.R. Licklider, who was a professor here for a while, and was a psychologist by training, not an electrical engineer. When Sputnik happened, ARPA was created, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and he was put in charge of their Information Processing Techniques Office, and gave seed funding to the first 5 computer science departments, which became part of this ARPANET, and began to build this vision of a decentralized network, a network with many different interconnecting and partially self-regulating sources of power. And it's really like the vision of taking that first proof of concept and actually continuing that tradition and trying to think about how can we reorganize our formal social institutions along that understanding of sort of complexity and interconnection and so forth that is the project of plurality. I think one nice expression of it that Audrey particularly likes is in the Vulcan philosophy from Star Trek of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. That states that it's the Vulcan belief that beauty, growth, and progress all come from the union of the unlike. Concord as well as discord requires the presence of at least two notes. And the brotherhood of man is an ideal based on learning to delight in our essential differences as well as learning to recognize our similarities. So to give it a formal definition, plurality is technology for cooperation across social difference. It is based on recognizing and proliferating social differences and at the same time empowering people to cooperate across them. And that I think is like kind of the core idea behind the concept of a network. And it parallels the way in which quantum mechanics, ecology, neuroscience, our modern understanding of the sociology of science, all are based not on a vision of the individual being guided by some broad organization to, act in the common interest, but instead of a diverse range of social groups overcoming the challenges of collaborating and being able to work together at the same time as their diversity continues to grow. Okay. Maybe I'll just pause for a second if anyone wants to ask any questions about the underlying conceptual frame.
Yeah, I have one. Usually
please.
when I listen to about any political agenda, I filter everything out, but fiscal and monetary policy. How fiscal and monetary policies will look under this vision. And I have two following questions: how property rights will look, and how property rights fit here.
Yeah.
And how do you envision individual freedom, and what's the notion of individual freedom under this vision?
I think that those questions will probably be easier to answer later when we get into more of the substance here, but suffice it to say, you're trying to project things onto a matrix that is not this matrix, and so the projection is going to take us long to explain. In other words, the whole terminology and frame that is in your mind is very sort of in the fourth dimension orthogonal to the frame here. So there are answers to those questions, but they sort of are far down the road of sort of following the logic and so forth. So, but anyway, I have a background as an economist, so I can communicate that way, but that's not the way I've come to find it sort of most productive to articulate these ideas. So maybe we should defer that to a little bit later. Carry on. Okay, so one way to think about this, one way we approach this is to think that, the usual frame is that democracy lies on a foundation of fundamental rights that enable people to meaningfully participate in that democracy. If you eliminate those fundamental rights, then it doesn't even really mean anything because people can be coerced and there's no meaningful sense in which you're hearing their voices. And I would argue that we've ended up in a digital world where a lot of those fundamental features of what it means to live in a democratic society are not sort of secured as fundamental elements of the underlying internet protocols, and are instead sort of proprietary services that are built on top. And in fact, that view is not mine. It's actually J.C.R. Licklider's from 1979. He has a wonderful piece called Computers and Government, in which he, just as TCP/IP is coming together, says that it's not going to be sufficient, that we're going to run into the following problems, and he predicts a lot of the issues that we've run into because some of these fundamental elements that the protocols need in order to sort of secure people a digital democracy or something like that are not in place. So one of these has to do with identity systems. So, there's the famous line that on the internet, nobody knows that you're not a dog, that you're a dog, right? And The only sort of workarounds that we've come to have for that are sort of identities supplied by a small number of large corporations whose walled gardens might partially interconnect, as opposed to the early visions that were actually quite well articulated by people like Licklider and Nelson of a network-based protocol for authentication and identification, where webs of trust relationships would enable you to contact and be connected to someone. Webs of trust that were secured by the underlying framework that made the internet possible. And in fact, there was very clear moments in which it was sort of decided like not to invest in making those things work. So that's one example. A second example is what you might call freedom of association. This again comes from Zimmel, but like a absolutely fundamental part of like what a democratic society is. In my mind, it's not about privacy so much, but about what I would call plural publics. So there's a beautiful line from de Tocqueville where he said that there is no character flaw that a tyrant is so happy to abide than egoism. Because the tyrant feels no need for you to love the state as long as you hate each other. That, in fact, like the core element of democratic freedom is not privacy. It is the ability to create groups not directly controlled by the state that have an internal shared understanding, have internal publicity, but are private from others. And that is like, there's a whole set of protocols I'll talk about later that are important to allowing people to achieve that, that are not really easily available in the context of the internet, where things very easily end up sort of either being public or in more recent iterations, like very individualistically, privately encrypted, but not enabling this kind of the equivalent of creating a clubhouse or a church or something like that online. A third aspect has to do with sort of what does property mean in this world? And the way that the internet architecture has evolved, it's very challenging to do the sorts of things that you would normally do in the physical world with things that are yours, to use them productively without having them be expropriated from you, to have some sort of regime of productive cooperation or sharing that is not extractive and centralizing. And there's a whole bunch of work on trying to address these issues that, again, very underinvested, not developed, federated learning, data cooperatives, protocols for time sharing in a horizontal way, et cetera. And finally, in the commercial realm, one of the first things that Licklider and in fact also Tim Berners-Lee said that the internet absolutely needed was like a native payments architecture. And some would argue that cryptocurrencies are kind of trying to supply that, but it's certainly not available as like a low-cost public service inherent to the structure of the web at present. And we view sort of the agenda, or a core agenda, foundational agenda for this plurality vision to be to provide those things, to build the architecture that enables these fundamental rights to exist in the digital world. Let me switch gears from those sort of like fundamental building blocks to some of the areas where we think that this type of a framework can be transformatively applied. So let me first talk about media. So right now, the increasingly less, but still dominant means of sort of digital native media is these sort of microblogging systems like Twitter. And because they're funded privately, they have an incentive to maximize engagement, or even if they have a subscription, some sort of entertainment value or like direct value to the end users, rather than, as was the case with many, prior media regimes, some mixture of that with a variety of public interest obligations. An alternative that has a very similar format, which is the backbone of this thing I described in Taiwan, is this system called Polis. So Polis is also a microblogging service. You make short statements. But rather than surfacing the content that you're most likely to enjoy looking at, it provides you with a articulation of the different centers of the conversation. So like, what are different positions that people have? And the agreements that people have across those differences. And in fact, this underlying mathematical structure is what powers the new community notes feature on Twitter. It's based on surfacing as, quote, facts, unquote, things that unite people across the patterns of division within the graph of Twitter sort of agreement. And I would argue that eventually this could be a foundation for fundamentally transforming the internet digital, like content ecosystem. We can imagine a world where rather than advertisers being the fundamental funders of the system, or even individual subscribers, a variety of different collective organizations provide funding like advertisers do for the system, in exchange not for just highlighting their content, but for taking the subgraph for which they are responsible and sort of making it function better. And by that I mean allowing people within that subgraph to understand what divides them, to find common ground, and to effectively self-govern themselves. And because this would be happening at like many different levels of social organization, the overall effect would be pluralist, which is identifying interoperation and collaboration, and at the same time maintaining the diversity of social groups and highlighting its existence. Okay, a second example, which as you'll see, it uses a lot of the same sort of conceptual frame here, but it's very different. So we all are familiar, being people around business schools, with the problem that organizations often face of sort of different divisions within the company not working in the common interest of the organization and instead pursuing their own goals. Microsoft is particularly famous for doing an excellent job at encouraging this kind of behavior, though hopefully under Satya Nadella it's somewhat diminished, as shown in this XKCD cartoon. And I would argue that this basic problem, that organizations get fixed into a particular sort of set of cultural divides and are therefore unable to cooperate and come up with new ways of organizing themselves, is like at the root of many of the most fundamental problems in productivity in business. And a nice illustration of that outside the context of a single organization is Annalise Saxenian's wonderful book, The New Argonauts, in which he argues that the success of Silicon Valley and this region primarily arose from the fact that the universities not supply human capital, but rather a neutral space in which people who work for different organizations would interact and discuss work-relevant matters, and therefore come to collaborate and eventually form new enterprises that were, transformational. And so a natural thing that you might ask is, without having a top-down system like we did at Microsoft. I worked in the office of the CTO, and our job was basically go around and talk to everyone in the company and try to like figure out how to reorganize things to meet upcoming technologies. And instead of having that, can you imagine protocols that would empower this kind of organizational solidarity and dynamism? And I would argue it's conceptually a very similar type of problem to this medium example I gave before. Some approaches that we've been taking to do this are something called quadratic funding, which is basically in a decentralized way, people commit resources to some common project, and then the center matches those different things based on the number of people as well as the amount they've contributed. So things with a broader base of support get more support. Now, that's still a very individualistic view. You'd actually probably want something more like the social distance in the org chart between the people is the thing that you subsidize if there's support across it. Because that's, in this pluralist view, more where incentives come from, not from individual desires, but instead from sort of the social setting in which you live. Okay, let me give a third example. So there's obviously been this revolution recently with foundation models. And these are very powerful. I'm sure you've been exposed to a lot of their capabilities. At the same time, there's like one obvious problem that they should solve and can't, which is that, so essentially all breast cancer could be cured if we had better image detection. Why is that? Breast cancer is almost never dangerous if caught early. And regular mammograms either are standard or would be standard if we believe that image detection on them were more reliable. And so breast cancer is not as much a disease as an image detection problem, in other words. And why don't we have models at the quality of GPT-4 for doing breast cancer detection? Because the largest database on breast cancer in the world is tiny because of medical privacy regimes. And so there's basically, none of these organizations have been able to find a way to share their information and cure a disease that affects all of their patients. This problem is a very complicated one. There are technical aspects to it, there are social aspects, there are legal aspects to it. Federated learning is part of the potential solution, another number of types of data collaboration organizations. But the main point I want to get across is like the fundamental problem in many of these settings is actually one of how do you get these different organizations to collaborate while maintaining the independence and secrecy and so forth that they all need, and like that's a core part of this agenda. Okay, let me turn to three kind of open research questions in this area that maybe will interest people. There's many more, of course, as well. So one is the problem of what I would call plural publics. This is returning to this issue of like reconceptualizing privacy in terms of sort of social organizations. So context is fundamental for human communication. In fact, the fact that you can understand the words coming out of my mouth right now and that they don't just sound like gibberish is because we share a common context, which is called the English language. So we all spent years establishing this context, and we have this sort of common knowledge that everyone has an understanding of English that is what enables us to have conversations like this. And while the internet has been an incredible engine for transmitting information, arguably it could have actually reduced our ability to communicate. At least it's possible. Why? Because it's undermined our ability to understand and protect context. So what do I mean by that? To understand context, you need to have a clear confidence of what the information set is that is shared by all the people that you're talking to. And to protect context, you need to ensure that information shared in that setting is not reshared outside of that setting. Because if you don't have that confidence, you will not be willing to use the context, because you will expect that whatever it is that you share will be shared in this broader setting in which that context is not present. And precisely because the internet has allowed information to be reshared so easily, it has both made it hard for us to predict what is going to be shared information among the people who hear things we say, and it's increased the ability for that information to spread outside that context. This is something that sociologists and communication scholars have written about sort of like endlessly. It might seem a bit abstract, but let me try to give you like a very extreme example of how destructive this problem of sharing information outside of context can be. So here's an example, which really is just sharing information outside of context, but that gets to something much weirder. So right now, many of us put many things into sort of a public setting. And that information is increasingly going to be usable to create simulations of us. So in fact, my co-author Audrey Tong has done this. Everything she does is totally transparent. So there's like thousands of hours of videotape of her and all kinds of documents, et cetera. She has used this to fine-tune a model that now does most of her work. And it even gives interviews for her. It writes poetry for her. But of course, given that all that was public information, the Chinese Communist Party could do the same thing and then have it do things that maybe she wouldn't want it to do, right? So what that means is that information we share can be decontextualized, can be taken to somewhere where we really did not mean for it to go, and could be used to attack our families, to steal from them, to defame us. Like, your whole existence online at some level depends, as a separate entity, depends on some maintenance of context in the resharing of information you create. And this, I would argue, is like in pretty sharp contrast to the usual distinction between publicity and privacy. So just to make that clear, let me give you two things that are sort of on the dividing line between public and private, but that are sort of as far apart from each other as public and private things are. One is the like secret plan of a football team, of like what they're going to do in the next play. And the other is information that's hiding in plain sight, that was not just, whatever, but it's buried and nobody knows that it's there. So the former thing is extremely hidden, it's extremely private, and yet it's also, in a profound sense, public among the set of people who share that information. The latter thing is completely unhidden, it's public, but nobody knows it. And therefore, there's absolutely no common understanding of it. And so what I claim is that like what we're actually after, what we actually need to engineer, is the ability of people to shape and condition these patterns of shared knowledge, to maintain the integrity of the context in which they share things, to establish shared bases of knowledge, and then to protect those shared bases of knowledge. And that this is like inherent to like what actually, when people talk about privacy preservation as being important to democracy, this is actually what they're after. I'll talk just a little bit about a couple of tools that I think are potentially powerful for achieving this. One is distributed ledgers. So distributed ledgers have the property that something sort of gets added to the ledger when there's wide acknowledgement that that thing should be added. So that's a sense of creating common knowledge, at least among machines. But there's another cryptographic tool that's widely used in sort of the crypto world that's relevant to this, which is called the designated verifier signature. So this allows you to send proof of some fact to someone, but to make it impossible for that person to reshare that proof to anyone else. It looks like it's a fake if they try to do that. So my claim is that, these are a couple of illustrations of elements that in combination can allow for this sort of control of the social structure of information in a richer way than just publicity and privacy. Okay, let me give you another example that connects to very different technologies. So there's a variety of institutions that are fundamental to like the modern state. You might call them the Bavarian state. Private property, identification by passport, the way that voting systems and educational systems work through very rigid structures. And there's a wonderful book by James Scott called Seeing Like a State, which is about sort of all the problems for especially people in marginalized communities, but really everybody, that is created by like having to fit into these structures. They just like don't actually make sense for most contexts. And like a lot of the way that we live is like just to conform to these things rather than because there's any underlying good reason to do it. The remarkable thing about these generative foundation models is that they're incredible universal translators. They're capable of taking things from more or less any format and turning it into any other format. And so there's the potential that this might dramatically relax the constraint on diversity that's created by the need to interoperate with each other. That people might be able to live in much richer, more sensible, more adapted ways to their context and yet still understand each other, still know whether someone's a good candidate for a job or whether this property can be developed at some price or et cetera. Okay. Finally, let me talk, and this will come back to something that's closer to an economics framing, about this idea of cooperation across difference. So like in the standard econ frame, like mechanism design, that's the field that I came from, wants to say there's a social planner and there's a bunch of selfish individuals. And we need to set up the rules so that the selfish individuals act in the global common interest. What I want to encourage us instead to think about is that what there actually is diversity and intersectional diversity. People are part of a bunch of different social communities. And when two people who have very little socially in common meet, there's a tendency for them to have low trust or to be potentially in conflict with each other. And that when people with a lot of social overlap connect, they are unlikely to come into conflict. They're likely to find a way to cooperate. And so the problem is much less this invisible hand problem and much more what you might call the Star Trek problem. I don't know how many people watch Star Trek, but like what happens over the course of Star Trek, it goes over the course of a few hundred years. But sort of over time, there's like all these different species and they're all in conflict. And gradually they kind of find ways to work with each other and they get into less and less conflict. But then they encounter new species that are still in conflict with them and then they reconcile, et cetera. Like that's kind of like more the vision of like enormous diversity and the struggle to cooperate across that diversity. Okay, so like how might we turn this into kind of a technological or mathematical problem? I would point you towards this quite brilliant thinker, Lionel Penrose. So Penrose, the father of Roger Penrose, the great astrophysicist, he was a eugenicist as well himself, so he did a variety of different things. But he had this principle called Degressive proportionality. So Degressive proportionality, I think, can be nicely captured by a auditory analogy. If you're in a room full of people talking, somehow you're still able to hear the person sitting next to you. Part of that has to do with focusing, but a lot of it has to do with a very simple statistical property, which is that uncorrelated signals cancel each other out, at least partially. whereas correlated signals don't. And so uncorrelated information only grows at the rate of the square root of the contributions, whereas correlated information grows linearly in its size. This is a very general principle. If you think of generalized least squares estimation, it's all about this. It's all about dealing with correlated versus uncorrelated signals. So what Penrose pointed out was that if you want to create equality of power when some voices are more correlated than others, it's critical that you effectively downweight the correlated component by the square root. And again, this is what generalized least squares estimation does, right? You take you take the correlation matrix and you basically downweight the underlying correlated components so that you can see the independent information that exists in the system. And this principle was applied in the Nice Treaty. The countries were given vote shares proportional to the square root of their population size. It's also used in this thing called quadratic voting that I've been very involved in. So in quadratic voting, there's like value floating around, and the correlating unit is the individual. It's thought that the individual is perfectly correlated, and so you want to take, if an individual expresses a strong preference on something, and take the square root of however much they do to create an equalization of power between the correlated individual and the uncorrelated voices of everybody else. And this is now used in a whole range of things, including government decisions in various places and the allocation of capital by this organization called Gitcoin and other open source funding organizations, et cetera. But we claim that both of these are very special cases of a much broader principle, which is that individuals can correlate, organizations can correlate, nation states can correlate, all these different things can create correlation, and what you want to be doing is actually sort of finding the independent set of signals and sort of hearing those each independently and then downweighting all those forms of correlation. And that's something that we're working on quite a bit. And that, of course, is just like the linear version of the problem, the linear quadratic version of the problem. There's much more sophisticated versions that deal with the nonlinearities that go into things like neural nets. And so there's this like sort of rich problem of kind of making the contact between what you might call social choice theory or mechanism design on the one hand and neural networks on the other hand. Okay, if you're interested in this stuff, a few different ways to connect. Contribute to the book, open public collaboration governed by the same principles that we're articulating in the book. Plurality.net. You can also email me at Glen@plurality.net. We have an academic professional organization of people who are doing work in this area, Plurality.institute. Check that out, we have conferences. And then at Microsoft, I lead this thing called the Plural Technology Collaboratory, where we build tools around this stuff in collaboration with academics. Thank you so much.
Awesome. We're right on time. We may lose a few people in person and online, but we do have a seminar next week, and you're giving it. Can you give us a preview of what you're going to talk about?
Yes, I'll be talking about Reddit and personal relation on Reddit.
All right.
Thank you.
And I don't have hard stops if anyone wants to chat, I'm around.
Yeah, let's open floor. Thanks for joining us, everybody.